the church has said, look, we want to engage in the best science of the day and try to understand what that reveals about the world. And so
Right.
as more of that science has developed, a better, deeper, richer understanding of evolution, I think you've seen the church become more engaging with evolutionary theory, particularly with Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II.
Hello. So this is the Society of Catholic Scientists podcast, The Catholic Scientist, and I am Steve Barr, the president of SCS, and our guest today is our co-host, Dan Kuebler, who's a professor of biology at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and he has just written a book, an excellent book called Doctrine and Darwin, or is it Darwin and Doctrine? I'm sorry. The Compatibility of Evolution and Catholicism. It's an excellent book, and I'm going to interview him, or we're going to have a conversation about the book today.
Yeah,
hello, Dan.
Yeah, good to see you. And so the book is been out, just came out this summer, and it's through Word on Fire Press. And so if anybody's interested in finding it, you can just go to Word on Fire Press bookstore, and it's there. It's the best place to get it.
The best place to get it, though I'm sure they can get it at Amazon and other places too, if they. Yeah, so let me ask you, what led you to write the book?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've been a professor at Franciscan University of Steubenville. I've been here for 24 years, and in that time, I've taught a course in evolution in the biology department for biology students, and then I also teach a number of survey courses for non-majors, and we talk about evolution in there. And so I always get lots of questions. If there's the one topic that comes up in my survey course that students really are, concerned about or have a lot of questions about, it's about evolution. And so this book is sort of written to respond to, those questions that I get from my students that we talk about in class, and to put those out there for a general audience. In particular, for two groups of people. One, it's Catholics who, are being told, that by a friend that, you can't, I think evolution is correct, and that's why I left the faith. So people that are leaving the faith because they think science is showing that the teachings of the faith are moot at this point. And so to equip them with the resources to be able to engage these people that they know who have lost their faith because what evolution has demonstrated.
Right.
Yeah. And then the other.
Yeah. Oh, the other group. Yes, there are two groups.
Yeah, the other group is just for those people that are Catholic, but and they're not, the people that have been told, hey, I have to reject evolution to maintain my faith. It's, so it's on both ends. There's people that have rejected one or the other, just so they can see that no, there is a compatibility there, and this is how you might work out that compatibility, and then you don't have to jettison one or the other.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. This seems to be increasing a little bit, because when I was growing up, I'm an old codger by now. When I was growing up and was a kid in grade school in the 60s and in college, I'm sorry, in high school, I did not think, was not aware that anybody thought that evolution was contrary to Catholic faith. It was just not an issue back then. Maybe I didn't know what was going on, but it seems there's more of that. And I remember being surprised because I was talking once to a Catholic college student many years later, and I said, and she seemed to think the church had condemned evolution, and I said, it hasn't, never did, and she was incredulous. So, so it seems that there is something, this idea out there. But before we get into that, so that's why you wrote the book, and I think it's very much needed. Maybe you could tell us a little about the structure of the book overall, how the book is put together.
Yeah. So a lot of the big questions that people ask about evolution, I have in the second half of the book, about, how do you reconcile chance and purpose in evolution? How do you fit humans into the evolutionary story if we were created in the image likeness of God? And, how do you deal with, people that argue evolution just shows that there's no purpose and so forth? Those big questions I think students and adults also struggle with, that
Right.
have an issue reconciling the two. So that's the second half of the book. It gets into a lot of those interesting questions. But before you can actually talk, I think, intelligently about those, you have to be using the same language. So the first half of the book, talks about what is the Catholic understanding of creation? What's that mean? What do we mean by the term evolution? Right? Because people mean a million different things by that. And so I focus on what is the scientific evidence and definitions of evolution. And then also, what has the church said about this? Right? Because a lot of people, like you said, have this misnomer. Oh, the church has condemned evolution, or the church has said you have to believe that Adam was created ex nihilo or something like that, his
Mhm.
body, and so they have these misconceptions about what the church has actually said about evolution. And so that's what the first half of the book is trying to clear away some of these misunderstandings, so we can actually talk sort of intelligently about those bigger questions.
Right. I thought that was very helpful. That the book, that the first half went through, the theology, the church's understanding of creation, and a relation of faith and reason, and so on, and the science of evolution. I thought that was extremely helpful. I mean, I've been reading about evolution for many years, but I've learned things from the. It's very pedagogical, very clear explanation of the science of evolution, and the church's historical engagement with evolution. So maybe before we get into the science, so what has been, I mean, so as I said, a lot of people out there, I discovered to my surprise when at one point, that a lot of people think the church, they think the church once condemned evolution, is sort of grudgingly kicking and screaming, kind of, or not screaming, but sort of reluctantly and grudgingly admitted finally recently that maybe evolution might have happened. But tell us about the real story there, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions. I think it's very interesting. The first roughly 90 years after Darwin, Darwin published in 1859 the first edition of Origin of Species. In those 90 years, and Kenneth Kemp, we've had on this, has a great book about those details. But the church did not have any official statements on evolution during that time. But there was a lot of people in the church that were discussing these, writing different ideas about humans might have evolved. The body, physical structure may have evolved, but there's this, obviously more to humans than just a physical body, right? There's this
Right.
creation of a rational soul that goes along
Right.
with the conception of every human being. And so, there was a lot of debate back and forth amongst scholars, amongst Catholics. And there were certain Catholics that were just like, no, this is terrible. You can't believe this. This is crazy. But that wasn't the church's position. Just like you have Catholics that argue for a flat earth. So it doesn't mean that that's what the church, his
Right.
position is. And so I think the church just sort of looked at the evidence and saw the science as it developed, and was wary of some of the philosophical implications that people were arguing about. And so the
Right.
church was very clear from the beginning that any use of evolution to demonstrate man's just a material being, or that we don't have a spiritual soul, or that there's no God, that everything is just purposeless, for all the way down. The church has
Right.
condemned that from the very beginning, right?
Right.
And even since Humani Generis, which was the first time the church mentioned the theory of evolution and
That's in
biology,
1950, right?
1950, right? So 90 years after Darwin. Even from that time, the church has not endorsed evolutionary theory, right? So the church
Right.
isn't in the business of like endorsing quantum theory or
Right.
cell theory, right? But the church has said, look, we want to engage in the best science of the day and try to understand what that reveals about the world. And so,
Right.
as more of that science has developed, a better, deeper, richer understanding of evolution, I think you've seen the church become more um, engaging with evolutionary theory, particularly with Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II,
Right.
really seen in the science of evolution, okay, an understanding of God's creation that we need to understand to be able to fully understand how God operates in the world, and and how he operates with us and so forth. So I think it's become an area of rich research and openness between science and faith in the last 30 years. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there does seem to be this increase, particularly the last 10, 15 years, of people for a variety of different reasons that think the two things are opposed, or they're rejecting evolution because they're still stuck in this idea that evolution has this atheistic implications. And so therefore
Right.
we've got to reject it,
Right. So, I mean, from your book and Kenneth Kemp's book, the historical part, it seems that the church took a wait and see attitude to some extent, because they're very complicated questions, as we'll see when we talk later about the last half of your book. There are a lot of philosophical and theological and scientific questions that Darwin's theory raised, and they're all tangled up. And there was a wide spectrum of opinion in the church, from people like, as you said, this is crazy stuff, this is intolerable,
Yeah.
that we came from apes, and that kind of thing, or to people who didn't see any particular difficulty with it. But I think the church was patient and let the debates continue, and more or less, and then, which I think is appropriate. I mean,
Yeah.
you want to come to snap judgment. So what do when we talk about evolution, what do we mean? Because it can mean many things, as you said, to many people. And I think often you hear people make statements like evolution is contrary to Christianity, the Bible, or, evolution tells us this, that, or the other thing. But sometimes they mean different things. So tell us what evolution, what the theory of evolution, the different aspects or components
Yeah.
of.
No, that's the $1,000,000 question when you're trying to engage somebody about it. Make sure you're using the term in the same with the same meaning. So, I mean, the first thing, and the church has been clear on this from the beginning, is that when it talked about evolution and humanity generis all the way through the present day, is that we have to distinguish sort of the philosophies that get attached to evolution versus the science, right? So when in my chapter, when I talk about evolution, I'm talking about the science of evolution, not some theistic or atheistic implications. All right, we can discuss those later, and I do discuss those later in the book. But what does the science of evolution show? So what does it demonstrate about changes in the material world of physical beings? How might they change over time? And so if we're focusing just on the science of evolution, I think as Catholics, if we're actually studying the natural world that God has created, I think as Catholics, we have good reason to believe that what the science of evolution is going to reveal is going to be stuff that is not going to be contrary to what God has revealed through, revelation, right? And so, and scripture. So that's the point one. So what is the science of evolution? I distinguish sort of three different levels in the book. And I do this because, I think it's important, because people often see that there's a lot of debates about the third level I'm going to get to, and then say, oh, evolution is just up in the air. Nobody knows for sure if it actually happened and so forth, right? So first is just sort of historical evolution, right? This is the idea the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the organisms on the planet have changed over time. So if we go back and look at the organisms that lived a billion years ago, they're going to be different than the ones that were there 500 million years ago or 400 million years. So, by dating igneous rocks and looking at the stratification and looking at the different fossils, you can get very, very good evidence for the age of the Earth and this sort of the general pattern that we see in the fossil record, where you don't see mammals until virtually 150 million years ago, right? So you don't see hard-bodied animals until roughly 500 million years ago. That type of thing. So that, I think that's pretty well established, right? There's very good evidence for that.
Right.
The second is common descent, right? The idea that all of these organisms, these species that have lived there over this history are related by common descent. So species A over time can give rise to variable offspring that can lead to a new species, species B, and so forth. So that is there's a different set of evidence. It requires historical evolution, right? But there's a different set of evidence you use for that. And there's a lot of sort of genetic similarities, genetic defects that organisms share that make sense, great sense in terms of positing common descent. So I think there's very good evidence for that. And if you look at in the scientific community, everybody sort of agrees that the evidence is very strong for that. You don't get much debate about historical evolution and common descent.
Yeah, common descent. Sometimes people call it common ancestry. Is that
yes? Yeah,
that all the different species on Earth sort of have a common stem. They all branched out from some original one, or maybe a handful of forms, like beginning, maybe a one-celled organism, and then they all branched out.
Yeah, so you have a community of cells, or one cell, or a community of cells at the very beginning, and from that community out, all the living organisms eventually develop, and so are all related in some way by common descent. And that's that one then poses the question: how are humans? It includes humans. Humans are related by common descent to other hominids and primates, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But
the third level.
Yeah, the third level, right? So that is the mechanism. What explains how does species A change to species B? And that's the most controversial amongst scientists, right? So there's a lot, ever since Darwin, there's been debate about this, about what drives the process of evolution, what natural processes do that, right? And so there's a debate about what natural processes do that. Is it just natural selection and sort of random chance mutations? That was sort of the synthesis, the modern synthesis, which kind of hardened in the 1940s and 50s. But there's a lot of, particularly in the last 20 years, and I talk about this briefly in the book, there's this what's called the extended evolutionary synthesis, this idea that there's other natural processes that drive evolution forward, that drive the origin of new forms, right? And natural selection plays a role, but there's these other factors, other natural factors, naturalistic factors, like symbiosis, where organisms, combine and fuse DNA, or sort of epigenetic factors, or organisms can alter the expression of genes and pass that on to their offspring, or other processes where you have developmental fields that have this ability to handle change and incorporate it and make new structures based on small perturbations. So there's all these interesting, and it's a very fruitful area of research, I would say. So and a lot of these ideas in the extended evolutionary synthesis were not new. They were ideas that people had in the 1800s, and so these debates have been ongoing as we sort of understand what's driving evolution. And I think that's one of the reasons I think the church was very good, was wise to stand back and let's let this debate sort of play out. And then it became pretty clear common descent was well established. The natural mechanism doesn't really in terms of our theology, doesn't make too much of a difference in terms of our theological understanding. But that's where the debates are. And some people will say, well, look, there's all this debate about the mechanism of evolution, therefore we can just throw the whole thing out, So
but that's really all of these new ideas about evolution are building on Darwin. I mean, it's not like there's been a revolution that overthrew Darwin. It's really refining and developing it, and finding that there's more things that Darwin didn't know about. I mean, he didn't know about genetics, for example. But it's building on his basic insights, which are still valid, right? I mean, his basic
insights, and that's the thing. When you look at Origin of Species, it's a lot more expansive. About he had different ideas and mechanisms in there than just random variation and so forth. He thought there were some certain laws of evolution and certain some order there to the evolutionary process. In a sense, he also thought that there might be some type of epigenetic change. He didn't call it that, but sort of Lamarckian change. So he wasn't, but
as narrow as sometimes. So
exactly.
let me. This is a good way to segue into the last half of the book, which is there. So the first half of the book is 5 chapters, which lay the foundations for the later discussion. Then the last 5 are each one takes up a kind of important issue or that comes from evolution. And so maybe we can go. This naturally leads into chapter 6, which is about chance, and chance and its role in evolution, and whether it's consistent with a Christian worldview. So many people are bothered, and I'll ask you why that is. Many people are bothered by this idea. I mean, they've heard of random mutations, and they get the sense that it's all a big lottery, a crapshoot. That evolution,
Yeah, exactly.
it's all just it's all just chance, and that really bothers them from a number of points of view, which we can get into. I think
Yeah.
this is one of the main
Yeah,
things.
no, I think that's one of the things that people struggle with, and you're very good on this as well, understanding the sort of chance and purpose, how you unite those. But the first is the issue. Even if evolution was nothing but chance,
Yeah,
it was just nothing but randomness all the way down, right? That doesn't preclude a purposeful God or a purpose to the evolutionary process, right? And so we see, and I always find it interesting, and I think it's because of this, because there's chance events and randomness that goes on in our everyday lives, and people don't get as freaked out about that as they do about the chance and randomness that's there in the evolutionary process. I always find that
right,
interesting.
right. I think you say this right off the bat in the chapter, and I think this is really important, that this is not a new problem. I mean,
Right.
St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church Fathers dealt with this question of, on the one hand, there's obviously a lot of events in the world, and you point out that each of us is the product of thousands, hundreds of thousands of chance events. I mean, our parents happening to meet, and their parents
Exactly.
happening to meet, and all sorts of things. Um, and that, people don't. That doesn't seem to bother people, to the everyday person, though theologians have reflected on this.
Right, exactly. And I think the reason it doesn't bother people partly is that when it comes to evolution, people have made the arguments, and there's loud voices that these atheists that make the argument, look, evolution is random, therefore there's no purpose. So people, that argument is being made. So it's resonant, and people have heard that, right? They haven't heard, there's not many people running around saying and writing books like your parents' meeting was random, so therefore
I think
you have no
you
purpose,
froze
right?
for a few minutes. I think we might want to go back a little bit, because I think you froze a bit there.
Okay.
And some of what you said. So you were saying, why this why this chance in everyday life doesn't bother people that much, but when they hear that evolution is about chance, that does bother them, and you were explaining why that was.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I think that evolution bothers them from this chance perspective is because there are very loud voices that are making that connection. They're saying, look, evolution is just chance and randomness, therefore there's no purpose to the world or to you. And people don't make that argument often, like, oh, your parents met by a random chance event, therefore there's no purpose in the world. So they don't hear that. So I think they're responding to these atheistic arguments that are built on evolution. And so they have an issue with that. But the point is, like you said, the church has been dealing with this idea of how do you reconcile chance and purpose from the very beginning. And so Thomas Aquinas talks about this, and the idea is God being outside of time. Chance events are things that only operate because God allows them to operate, right? And so they're not outside God's providence. God being outside of time, there really isn't anything that we could properly call chance from God's perspective, right? And
yeah,
so
I had a very nice sentence in your book, very nice paragraph, where you say all the different, God sustains everything in existence and everything that they do, and the chance encounters between different creatures are a part of God's plan. That the chance encounters and the chance events are God's plan. So it's not one or the other. I thought that was very good.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Then there's a
so
number.
one of the things that you talk about is, some people, they feel that it's either chance or there's purpose. I mean, and you have a nice example. Like if you find a rock, like they find these pieces of ochre that you pointed out in prehistoric sites, and there's scratches on the piece of ochre, and it's question, were those scratches sort of accidental scratches when a boulder fell on it, or were they scratches made by some prehistoric humans who put them there for some purpose. And so there is some sense in which we see a distinction or alternative chance or purpose, and that's makes people think that is one of the things that bothers people. Are we intended by God? Are we are we part of God's plan? Did God plan that the human beings, in particular I, show up on the scene, or
Yeah.
is it just a fluke? And then there's a famous quote from Stephen Jay Gould you talk about that sort of highlights this.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, the idea when we look at like things that operate around us, it's it's either one or the other. It's either
Yeah,
chance or purpose, right? But with God, we're looking at he's not a cause in the world like you and I. So we're
yeah,
not competing. So if something happens by chance, it doesn't mean God isn't involved. God is sort of the primary cause of everything that happens, right? And
right,
so he's not competing like this a competing explanation like we normally have when we're looking at you know uh, things that happen in the world. Yeah, and one of the other things in that chapter that I focus on is
yeah,
that when you look at evolution, right, there's a huge amount of order to it, right? So
right,
again, even from a scientific perspective, people are getting it wrong if they just think evolution is just a chance and randomness, right?
yeah,
This idea I talk about this idea of convergence in evolution, which is pretty well sort of established and known in the field, is the idea that the underlying physics and chemistry um, dictate that certain solutions are going to be robust and are going to be found by the evolutionary process over and
right,
over again, right? Because evolution is dependent upon this underlying order in the physics and chemistry, right? And I give the sort of the analogy of why there are only sort of 82 stable elements, right? That
mhm,
those emerge from the underlying order in the physics, right? And so
right,
we live in a
right. I mean,
universe
this is
that these specific things that can exist. And the same thing, once you've got this certain chemistry, there's certain proteins structures that are going to exist, and then there's going to be
right.
certain larger structures. So evolution to some extent is predictable, but it is absolutely dependent on a huge amount of order that sort of drives evolution forward.
Right. I mean, that's a big part of this chapter in your book, and I think extremely helpful is that it's not all just chance and random events. It's all based on. I mean, you couldn't even have a living thing. You couldn't or evolution at all unless you had the underlying physics and chemistry that allowed it to happen. And there's a ton of order at that level. So and there's so you quote Stephen Jay Gould as he was a famous evolutionary biologist, said, well, if you reran the tape of history somehow, if you could, then it'd be unlikely that you'd have beings like human beings arising. You'd get completely different organisms. In that sense, that kind of bothers people because, wow, if you ran the experiment a million times and we only come out once, how are we? Does that really suggest that we were kind of planned or built into the whole? But you talked about convergence and how so explain to us,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe give us some examples
So
from your book about what is convergent evolution.
yeah, convergent evolution is the idea, and it's the observation that you see similar structures and behaviors evolve more than once independently. So
Right,
if you run evolution, you see like powered flight evolves multiple times. The camera-like eye that you and I have, right? The focus light is evolved, once in like squid and octopi, once in sort of mammals and vertebrates, for example.
right,
And then you also see it evolve a couple times in insects. And there's one type of jellyfish that actually has sort of a camera-like eye that focuses the light. So there's something about the camera-like eye. It's a good solution given the properties of light and the properties of diffraction. That's going to evolve multiple times, right? If you
right,
think about the form that organisms have to move through water, right? That given the viscosity of water and the need to move through it, you see fish and sharks and aquatic mammals all develop and evolve sort of the same form. So the physics and chemistry not only had to be have a lot of order for evolution to even get off the ground. They also drive evolution in certain directions. And so
Right.
to counter sort of Stephen Jay Gould, the counter to him is this paleontologist Simon Conway Morris, who wrote this book, Life Solutions and Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. And I quote him in that chapter. He argues that a lot of evolutionary forms are predictable. And if we reran evolution again, we would get a lot of similar forms. The timing in terms of when they would emerge and when they would appear is going to be variable because there's a lot of chance events that go into it. But what works is what works, right? And so there's certain things that you're never going to get. You're not going to get flying elephants given the force of gravity on Earth, right? But if you run evolution again and there's animals that are moving in water, they're going to look very similar because bilateral symmetry is a great way to organize in a three-dimensional space, and then you got to deal with the viscosity of water, right? And so there's a lot of similarities that will emerge, and so humans might not be, sort of this, sort of random event, but sort of a maybe an expected outcome of the evolutionary process, given the order that's there at the foundational level.
Right. I mean, I learned there are a lot of interesting things I learned from that chapter. I mean, so one of the sort of most dramatic examples of chance playing a huge role is the asteroid or that hit the Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula, wiped out. It's believed to have wiped out almost all the dinosaurs and sort of opened ecological niches, which then were filled by mammals. So the age of mammals, was it made possible? But you said that actually mammals have certain advantages over dinosaurs as far as surviving. They have certain built-in advantages, and it may very well have been that it was inevitable that mammals would eventually take over. It just that it happened then was due to a particular chance event, but some other chance event or sudden change in the climate or whatever may well that it be that it would have happened anyway, just at a different time. So I never thought about that.
Yeah, a lot of the traits that you say that mammals have, the ability to regulate their body temperature, giving birth to live young, having sort of good insulation in hair, those traits have evolved multiple times, right? And so the idea in multiple lineages, and so eventually you hit on an organism that has all the mammalian traits, and that allows them to have a diversity of niches that they can occupy, be able to handle, different, climates more so than say large reptiles and so forth. So on a planet where there's going to be continual environmental upheavals, eventually, once you get to mammals, they're going to take over, right? And it's not the exact environmental upheaval that leads to their spread might vary from from if you reran evolution multiple times, but you get something like that, right? And that's what you see.
So we can still see that there's a lot of, as you say, order. Actually, the dominant theme in evolution is order, both at the chemical and physics level, but also in the process of evolution itself. There are patterns and certain things that it's there's a lot of order in the whole process of evolution, and so we can still see that there's a plan there, and that we're part of that plan. It's not just chaos. It's not just haphazard. Anything might happen, and it's a total fluke. Somehow it's just a total fluke that we appeared on the scene. That's not really, that's not really correct. So let's turn to well, there's the next chapter in your book. Maybe we could skip that for now. I think that would actually be good for a whole episode. But it's about because it's the question of whether there are metaphysical objections or philosophical objections to the whole idea of evolution of species, and this has been a problem in the Catholic world, so to in a way, since Darwin. That is, there's a certain strain of Aristotelian Thomistic thought, not all of, but it's just a certain subset of Aristotelian Thomistic philosophers who argue that there's the very idea of evolution of species raises difficulties, but and they point to things in the writings of Aristotle and St. Thomas. They certainly did not have the evolutionary view of the origin of species, and so they. But I think that chapter in your book very makes it very clear that these are not insuperable objections, these
Yeah,
to evolution. And
exactly. Yeah, I don't want to,
we don't want
delve
to get
into
into that, because
yeah.
that would get into the weeds of that, and is it would
But it's
probably take
interesting.
forever.
I put it into the book just because there's been a sort of an increase in these
There's
arguments
been
that
an
I've seen
increase in
from
it.
students and from seminarians and from adults that that I've engaged about these issues, and I thought it was important to at least
It is
address them.
important, but yeah,
But
because it is
yeah, it
it
sort of
is
sticks out from the rest of the book. That's
these
for sure.
arguments never go away, and they're being raised anew. But it's interesting. The church never, when the church was deciding whether evolution was acceptable for Catholics to believe in, it actually focused not on sort of philosophical or even scientific objections to evolution, because the church said, that's for the scientists to figure out. And what the church was interested in is whether it went against any doctrine, whether evolution goes against any revealed truth. And so that was the focus of the concern. So they never really, they never decided these philosophical questions. So they're still percolating around today. But let's maybe we can have a future show about that. Bring on a Thomistic
Yeah,
philosopher
and there could
to
be
be
some good
part of
people
it.
to address that. Yeah.
But the next part that I think is two chapters are about human evolution, and that's always been the big biggie for the Catholic Church. I mean, from the beginning, plants
Yeah.
and animals, the Church never had a problem with evolution of plants and animals, or even with what particular natural mechanisms might be involved in that. It was all about the evolution of man,
Right.
and that's where the rubber hits the road. So, and I think for a lot of people out there, to put it in a nutshell, is it Adam and Eve or is it cavemen? Like these two pictures people have, like, well, either there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and there's a snake and a tree and all of that, and angels with flaming swords and so on, or you had all these cavemen running around, and they seem like
Yeah.
really different pictures. So that's sort of tell us
Yeah,
tell us
that's the
about
big,
that.
big $1 million question. Because as you point out, the way the church is interested about how this touches on Catholic teaching and dogma, and where does evolution really hit on that? It's the origin of humans. What are humans?
Yeah,
Is original sin a real thing or not? Those are the questions that most people, when it comes to evolution, are concerned about, and what the church is most concerned about, right?
right.
Because those are doctrinal questions. So if you are going to allow for, as the church says, the body of man may have evolved, but we have to hold to the immediate creation of the immaterial soul that did not evolve, right? And that the human is more than a material being. So the first thing before I jump into sort of human evolution is to recognize that evolution on its own is never going to be able to explain the totality of man,
Right.
right?
That's sort of like the big point. That's always, I think St. John Paul II called it the essential point, and that was the point for Pius XII back in 1950. And I think since the very beginning, as you show in your book, since the very beginning, since Darwin's day, all Catholics agreed that the spiritual soul is not evolved. That's conferred by God on human beings. But so it's all about the evolution of the body. That's the issue, right?
Right. Yeah. And so then the question is, what does science demonstrate to us about, human evolution and about what's called hominin evolution? So hominids are just any species that we find in the fossil record that is more similar to modern humans than in modern chimps, right? So the
Right.
idea is about 7 million years ago, there was a common ancestor, and one branch it gave rise to hominins and eventually humans, and the other branch it gave rise to modern chimps. So if you look at the hominid branch, particularly, most of the hominids we find are in Africa. And, when do we find sort of biological humans emerging, right? And you see, in Africa, evidence that you have sort of biological humans around 200 to 250,000 years ago. But there's not a scientific consensus on this, because there isn't a table you can look up and, oh, we found a skull. Oh, is this one similar enough to classify it as a biological human, or is it not quite, and so forth, because there is variability sort of in the human form, right? But
Right.
pretty clearly by about 200,000 years ago, you have creatures that look almost indistinguishable from modern day humans in Africa.
Right.
And then over time, you start to see cultural evolution, where you start to see sort of cultural artifacts that you would argue, at least I would argue, would be the type of thing that would only be done by someone who has rational conceptual thought. So a
Right.
spiritual soul, right? A theological human, I would call them, right?
Yeah. So
And
that maybe we can pause there for a second, because I think this is a very key point that you make in the book, a distinction between what do we mean by human? I mean, and there's a distinction between what a biologist might call Homo sapiens, biological humans, and what the church means by humans, theological humans.
yeah.
I think Pope Pius XII in 1950 called them true humans,
Mhm.
which is something with this immortal spiritual soul, right? So that
Right.
we have to be careful what we're even talking about when it comes to human, right?
Right. And that's the thing, as a scientist, a paleontologist is looking at fossil remains, can try to make a case where this thing is biologically human. When you say it's biologically human, at least with a fossil, you are just claiming that it is structurally similar.
Right,
It's structurally similar enough that you think it would be classified as the species Homo sapiens, right?
right,
And it's biologically human. You're not making, they're incapable of making the claim because it's not something that fossilized. This thing is theologically human. It's made in the image and likeness of God. It's in relationship with the creator in a special way, like modern humans. It has an immortal spiritual soul. That's not something that you can tell
right,
based on just the fossils alone, right?
right,
And it's clear that modern humans, like theological humans, mated with Neanderthals, right? And
right,
so there is an ability, within sort of biological humans, to mate with slightly other hominids that are slightly related, or highly related,
highly
with slight
related, right,
differences. Yeah, and so delineating species from a biological standpoint can be difficult, right?
right,
Because we don't know exactly where the structural cutoff is. We're learning more about how species are able to have some hybridizations, just like humans and Neanderthals and humans and another group of hominins called Denisovans, right?
right,
But that's all a question for science, right? Then the
right.
theological question, I think that most Catholics are interested in, is when did the first theological humans emerge? Where do you see, the Adam and Eve, right?
Right.
And as you pointed out, this idea that Adam and Eve emerge in a garden, ex nihilo, or from the God makes them from the dirt and puts them in this garden, and it's perfect there. That idea is not something the church definitively teaches, right? So
Right.
if you look at the Catechism, it talks about that story of Adam and Eve, uses figurative language to describe real events, right? So
Right.
there has to be a first theological human, right? That just
That's
by
a critical point. I was going
right,
to
yeah,
ask you that. I mean, something that a biologist, an atheist biologist might say, or even a Catholic who is thinking about this for the first time, they say, but species don't suddenly appear. It's a long, gradual process where there's small changes accumulate. So if you go back, you're not going to find the first horse. There's not one point like its parents were not horses and now it's a horse, because
yeah,
it's a gradual, and it's all little physiological changes and so on, until you see, oh, okay, now something really new has appeared, but there's no sharp
yeah,
dividing line.
right,
And but with humans, with the what we do have to believe is that, yeah, well, species, biological humans, a long, slow process in a population, because as you explain in your book, populations evolve. It's not individuals evolve, populations evolve. But with humans, it's sudden. There's a first human, or first humans, uh, before whom there weren't any humans, and then there are humans, a true
yeah, yeah.
human. and
Right.
it's a small number. It's not a whole population necessarily. It might just be two. So
Yeah.
so
So you're exactly right. So when you talk about biological humans evolving, you're right. It's going to be gradual change. It's not going to be easy to distinguish. Okay, oh, here's a big leap, and now you have a biological human, right? There is that because of this population evolving over time. But as the church has made clear, and it makes sense that the first theological humans would have been, it's a leap, right? You go
right,
from
because you
a
either have
creature
a
that,
soul or you either have an immortal soul or you don't have an immortal
right.
soul.
There's no half souls. You get three quarters. Now you get seven
Yeah,
eighths,
he's
and now
got a
you
bit of a soul.
got.
He's
I mean,
got
I
a
guess
little
there's some people
maybe.
like that, but
Yeah,
anyway, no.
well, there are people that you might.
Yeah, right, right. No, but
So
that's
that
the
I
idea.
think that distinction is actually that's one of the objections to evolution,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
to or place where people see a conflict, and the biological versus theological human distinction, I think, resolves that. But so anyway, I think that's a hugely important thing. But so another issue, I want to get to these things before we run out of time. Is the question of original sin, and because we do believe so. As you point out in the book, you have this wonderful quote from Origen in the early church. He was like the greatest scripture scholar of the early church, and he says he can't. Obviously, not meant to take all of the details seriously, like that that they were eating from a literal tree and so on and so forth. Um, but there are things we do believe, and one of them is the fall, that
right.
our first parents sinned, and that they and that we there are consequences to the whole human race
Yeah,
from
yeah,
that. So that's the subject of your I think the ninth chapter is basically original sin. So
yeah.
let me ask you a question there too. So a lot of people don't think that there's a conflict there, because from several points of view, like many people say, okay, death came into the world. We die because Adam and Eve sinned. And St. Paul says death came into the world. And but on the other hand, weren't plants and animals dying, and weren't those hominin ancestors of ours dying for hundreds of thousands of years, and
Yeah,
plants and animals for hundreds of millions or billions of years? So how can death have come into the world
yeah,
through original sin? So maybe you
right.
could explain that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a common question that I get, and it's interesting. The church has never taught that like animal death and plant death came into the world through original sin, right? It's
Mhm.
taught that human death and humans' relationship with creation, with God, and with each other has been damaged via
Mhm.
original sin, and that humans, now subject to physical death because of that, right?
Mhm.
And so even if you look back at Augustine doesn't think like, things like scorpions become poisonous after the fall. He's like, no, they just, before the fall, they humans were in right order. They were not in danger of those things or something,
Right.
somewhat. But there was still this, everything was sort of a natural order of creation that we see. It was still there. Lions still had sharp teeth and had to eat meat, right? So it's not
Right.
as suddenly lions were vegetarians before the fall and then started, so death it's like that physical death, and particularly spiritual death, right? The church talks about both physical death and spiritual death entering the world, and that makes sense only if you are a creature made in the image and likeness of God that can be in relationship with God and has an eternal destiny. Then spiritual death becomes a possibility.
Right.
And so this idea that there's this idyllic garden that humans were meant to be in, where there was no pain, no suffering, is not something that the church sort of teaches
Right.
or has taught, right? And it does make sense in terms of, if you do need to have a perception of pain to even just survive in a physical world, right? And not
Right.
like extreme pain, but
I mean, it's
if you
certainly animals. That's part of animal pain for animals is a part of their defense mechanisms, and so.
right, it's
But,
good.
and yet there is the teaching that for humans, we are subject to death because of the fall, and so were we created? So were we immortal?
Yeah.
Did we have bodily immortality, and why
Yeah.
was that?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think Augustine talks about this, and he said it's different. It's not necessarily humans were immortal, but we were given the gift of not having to experience death. We're a type of thing that would physically die, but it's a gift that God gave us so that we weren't going to die. And you think of, like, I always use like
It was
Mary as the example.
a preternatural gift.
Preternatural gift. Like, you think about Mary, not having any sin. What happened at the end of her life? Her whole body and soul goes to heaven, right? And so maybe
Right.
that's what we're meant to be in this world, and eventually, we a dormition where we pass on, because we're not meant for this world, right? We're meant to, so even when God creates us at the beginning, we're meant to be with Him in
Right.
eternity. So we have to. We're not meant to be here in the garden, quote unquote, for forever, right? So
Right.
there's something beyond this world we're meant for, and how we got there, if we not sinned, would, I think, look more like Mary than what we
Right.
have to do
So
now.
it's as, and you have this quote from Saint Augustine, and there are other church fathers who said similar things. Is it, as animals, we are animals, rational animals, but as animals, he says, Saint Augustine, in the quote you give in the book, says, by our natural constitution of our bodies, we are mortal. We're subject to death. But it was a special gift, this
Yeah, right.
preternatural gift from the Creator. He gave our first parents a special gift that they wouldn't be subject to bodily death, and they lost it. They kind of booted it.
Yeah,
But so the Catholic view isn't that as you said, it's not all plants and animals, and so it was a special gift that was offered to humans and that we forfeited. And so that reconciles what some people see as a contra. But not just that, but there's other preternatural gifts. So a lot of people would say, and you say in the book, a lot of even contemporary theologians out there, or modern theologians, say, well, isn't original sin? It's our tendency to violence and lust and selfishness and all this kind of stuff. Isn't that just something we inherited from our animal forebears? I mean,
yeah,
animals are selfish and they have aggression, and they certainly mate in their sexual
yeah,
appetites. And so isn't original sin just what we inherited from our ancestors, animal ancestors? And
yeah,
so you have a very clear answer to that.
yeah, yeah. Right. So when we think of original sin, it's sort of the lack of something, a gift that's been
Yes.
given to us. So so those biological drives and desires that we have to eat, to drink, to reproduce, and so forth, are, in at the beginning, because the preternatural gifts were ordered perfectly towards the good. So everything was properly ordered in man. Once we lose those gifts, right, through original sin, now you're left with just what the evolutionary process has provided, plus your intellect, which is now no longer properly ordered.
Right.
And so now those drives and desires are then used selfishly or in a sinful manner, right? But
Right.
those drives were there; they were just properly ordered, right?
And they're not, as I think you show that in the Catechism, those are not sinful. I mean, otherwise animals would be sinners, right? I mean, if
Right,
they,
right,
I mean,
exactly.
these impulses, these drives, aggression and sexual attraction and so on, they're not innately wrong. In fact, the Catechism says they're not. But in a human, because we're rational, they should be subject to reason. And in our first parents, as you said, by a preternatural gift, they were under the control of reason and sort of harmonious. But then we fell, and so now these impulses, we don't have a very easy time controlling them anymore. And so I think that's very important. This whole preternatural gift notion, which is traditional Catholic teaching, sort of gets rid of some of these apparent conflicts.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it's true that we inherit these from our animal ancestors, but the consequences of the fall isn't that we have them; it's that we can't control them
Can't
very
control
easily.
them. Exactly. And so the idea is that, the first humans would have emerged in a hominid population that had all these desires and drives and urges. But the first humans, the first, they emerge in this population at conception. They're given a rational soul, and the preternatural gifts that are develop, are made manifest over their lifespan, where they now are in relationship with God in a way that's different from the other hominids around them, right?
Right.
And they have these gifts to know God, to be able to understand God, to order their desires, and so forth. But then those first parents somehow turn away from God and fall and
Right.
lose those gifts. Now they're left with, a rational soul and reason that's no
Right.
longer properly ordering their desires. And so that's when their offspring may start mating with other hominids and so forth. And you
Right.
get sort of just sin enters the world. As Benedict
Right.
says, after sin, everything is disordered. Human relationships, humans with God, humans with nature. So sin enters
And
the
even
world,
our
and that's the world.
relationships within ourselves, our own internal.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think this is really helpful, very helpful. Your discussion of original sin. One of the other things that people worry about, I think St. Augustine and the people have worried about this for a long time, is how do we inherit it? So, I mean, I remember somebody asking a question at some point in an audience, asked somebody a question. Well, could we fix original sin if we find in the genome what it is that gives us original sin? But I've always wondered, how do we inherit? Because the church teaches we inherit original sin.
Yeah.
How do we inherit it? Is it a biological thing? And I think you make a very good point. It's not a thing that we're inheriting. It's as you said just a minute ago, it's a lack. It's an absence of something.
Yeah.
Right.
So our parents give us everything that they can. God gives us a rational soul at conception. And because that's what we're getting, we're not getting those gifts that the parents
Right.
have forfeited. There is the original sin, because it is are being transmitted human nature that is no longer in proper
Right.
order because those gifts are gone. So I
Right.
use the
We're
analogy of
getting the
parents.
fall. We're getting the
Yeah,
human nature from our parents, but without the special gifts that the first humans had.
yeah,
These without sanctifying grace and these preternatural gifts.
right.
So, and that's how it's not that we inherit it as a positive thing. It's that we're not inheriting.
Yeah, right. It's sort of like, yeah. So if I get, I'm using the analogy, if I got $1 million, and then I squander it, my parents, my kids no longer get that as a gift. So once we
Right.
squander a gift, it's no longer there to pass down to the.
Right. That's a beautiful, and you have a lot of very good explanations in your book. That's a good one. Yeah. Right. They would have inherited the $1 million, but the parents, forfeited. They
Yeah,
lost
right.
it, and then the kids don't get it. So I want to, at the end, there's something I think is really nice. Many nice things in your book, but you make some very interesting theological reflections on evolution, and I mean, one of them that had never occurred to me had to do with, there are certain ways that the evolutionary history and salvation history sort of parallel each other. One that I'd never thought of, which I found very striking. So, according to the sort of the older view before evolution, people thought, well, Adam was created as an adult. Many of the church fathers, many theologians thought God created Adam as an adult, and that sort of doesn't jive with what happened with the second Adam, that is with Jesus Christ. He didn't enter the world as an adult. He entered the world, in the womb of Mary, and went through all the stages of human growth and development. And so, from an evolutionary point of view, that also seems most likely, is that the first true humans, their parents were hominids that didn't have spiritual souls, and these true humans, though, developed in utero, and but had a spiritual soul, but they developed in the normal way, and that sort of matches more. But
Yeah.
I thought, I never thought of that, and that's true. There's a parallel, and a lot of people think, oh, it's how undignified for the first humans to be born of these disgusting animals. Well, maybe they weren't that disgusting, but animals, born in the womb of an animal. But
Yeah. No.
Christ, as you say in the book, God did not disdain being born in the womb of an animal, of a rational animal, but of a human. It was not. He didn't think that was too undignified for himself to be born of Mary. So
Right.
I love, but the another thing is you talk about the role of chance, and this maybe you could end with talking about this, the role of chance and sort of the way evolution unfolds, the way salvation history unfolds. There's some parallels there.
Yeah, yeah. So when you look at evolutionary history, there's a lot of sort of, chance events or where creatures do certain things that might affect the evolutionary process. And so the actual players in the evolutionary process can influence it and move it in
Right,
certain directions, right? And so it's open to creaturely causation. Creatures actually have real roles in the evolutionary process, right?
right.
They respond to mutations. They can even mutate their own genome. They do things that then can affect evolution, right? Even non living things, like an asteroid has the ability to affect the evolution. So there's these things these created things can actually act as causes that affect the evolutionary trajectory. And a lot of people go, "Oh, well, then God's not in control," right? Well, in
Yeah, and it
salvation
seems like
history,
they can even throw the whole plan off the rails or off the
right?
track.
Yeah,
You're going
exactly.
this way, and then all of a sudden something happens, and it just
If that darn
this.
asteroid hadn't hit Earth, we would have been
Yeah, I
fine, but
mean,
it hit
it's
Earth,
just
and now we're
everything
going
is
left
thrown off.
instead of
Off.
right,
Yeah,
and exactly. But the same exact thing happens in salvation history, right? In salvation history, it's not a neat linear path. You have, humans that are full of, foibles and sin, where they're part of the process of salvation history. So God allows creatures to be active causes and to be part of the story. And even when they try to send things off the rail, God's plan, just think of King David and sort of, he sends, I think, someone in
Uriah the Hittite, is it?
Uriah, yeah, into battle to kill so he can die, so he can, sleep with his wife and so forth. So that you have these sinful acts that are going on, but that doesn't throw the process of salvation history into the mud. That God
In fact,
writes.
sometimes it even. I mean, it looks like a disaster, as you say in the book. There's some things that look in evolutionary history like disasters, but they're disasters in salvation history. Like when Joseph in the Old Testament is sold by his
Yes,
brothers into slavery in Egypt. But that seems like, oh my goodness, that's a complete disaster. But actually, it turned out to be part of God's plan, or the destruction of the first temple and
right,
the Egypt and the Babylonian captivity that seemed like a complete disaster at the time.
right,
And many things in Christian history, even the crucifixion, as you say, to
right.
the disciples at first, that seemed like the complete
Yeah,
disaster.
yeah.
Um, but
And you
but
see, yeah,
there are these things that were not anticipated, that seemed disastrous, seemed to throw God's plan off the rails in both cases. But God's plan ends up unfolding anyway.
anyway, right,
And
and
then,
that's the idea. So I think if you don't like evolution history because it seems like creatures have too big of a role and they could have thrown it off the same thing happens with salvation history,
right.
and so you'd have to throw that out too. You'd have to say I have a problem with that. So I think it's interesting that God, the both stories are sort of written sort of in the same way, and their central events are often like the death and resurrection of Christ, this death and rebirth. You see that over and over again in
Death and
evolutionary
rebirth
history,
and
right? Death and
evolution, right.
rebirth, which is it's a central theme of this salvation history. And if the same God stands behind both, why wouldn't it be the central theme in both of them? I think so.
Right. And both of them start small. I mean,
Yeah,
it starts with the call of Abraham,
right,
and then there's stages, stages and then the people of Israel, and then so it's not, the church didn't sort of come into being at the very beginning. It was thousands and thousands of years, or thousands of years of historical development from very small beginnings before you have the church,
yeah.
right? And the same with evolution. I mean, we are the result of God seems to take his time in doing to start small, like the church started with just,
Yeah,
well, for Christ, and then it is the 12 and so on. He starts small, and things gradually unfold. So I thought that was very nice. There's so much in your book that I loved, and insights that had not occurred to me, and I've thought about these things for many years. So I thank you for that. It's very timely because, as you said, these ideas, started to come into sort of anti-evolutionism is starting to sort of seep into the church. I think when you and I were young, there was less of that, but the church seems to be it's seeping in, and I think your book is very timely in helping lay Catholics, both lay theologically and lay scientifically people, um, untangle or navigate through these complicated questions.
Yeah, that is exactly what I try to do. I don't have all the answers, so in that chapter on original sin, I give some ideas of how this might happen and how the fall, because a lot of this is lost behind the veil of history. But I think for a Catholic, the best thing is that can you make these things? Are there ways you can think about these that are fruitful and that complement each other? And I think that's the key. And I think you can, and I think that's what I try to lay out in the book, and then ways
Right.
of thinking about it that evolution and Catholic dogma resonate with each other. And, the one
Right.
about, how the new Adam and the old Adam, right? So the first Adam, our first parent being and following, what Christ did, being in the womb of a creature and and developing through normal development. So this might be a fruitful way of looking at it. We never know. We're never going to really know what happened with the first humans this side of eternity. But I think
Right.
just having ways that make sense, rational ways, that reasonable ways that make sense of these things, I think is sort of the key. And I think that's what I've seen in my students, and when you give them something like that, they really appreciate that, and then they can think about new ways of making these things fit.
Right. I mean, there's a lot, as you make it clear in the book, there's a lot of unanswered scientific questions, not only about evolution, but about human origins. And there's a lot of theological questions that the church has never definitively answered. So there's a lot of room for people to wrestle with this or to think about it. And I think your book is really, I'm not just saying this because you're my friend, and I think I can't think of another book that I would recommend. If anyone asked what book to read about Catholicism and evolution, this is the one I would recommend to them. And I've read quite a few others. Anyway,
I
so
appreciate
maybe
that. Thanks.
go ahead.
No, I appreciate that recommendation. Thanks.
Okay, so let's maybe we can call it to an end there, and there's plenty of topics we could discuss in future episodes about evolution and Catholicism. I think we just scratched the surface today. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.